very grim set of statistics here out of New York. Just as everybody's joining us, I just thought I'd share this. This is in the New York Times. I wonder if it's today, April. No, it's from several days ago, actually. So it may even be before the most recent uptick in the deaths counted in New York, because I think what had happened was the deaths that had not actually formally been tested in New York. This is Sam Clark had pointed this out earlier here and tweeted this out, and I had missed this earlier. It's easy to miss lots of things these days. The remarkable thing about this is it shows you the deaths at September 11th, and it shows you this just remarkable upward tick here. And the other thing I think that's noteworthy is look at how these data most recently prior to the COVID-19 reporting are all dots, meaning that this is the expected deaths. They're things that are not actually in the database. That's one of the big problems with tracking these calamities with deaths, because death is a good measure of things. You can't, it's sort of a final thing. It's true that there have been accusations about some of the countries not reporting the deaths particularly accurately. I think Iran is one where there's some question about how well that's been reported. But the other thing is that it takes a while to report the death. You usually have a system in place of verification. And so this must be a little bit more than a year of data that are not actually released between the time at which things dropped off about a year ago during the peak of the cold and flu season in New York, and then up until this current peak, and then what has happened here, just an enormous spike upward, revealing the great increase in mortality associated with the coronavirus. There's much talk, of course, about how do you measure these things particularly well. Deaths are a good measure. The problem is it's not easy to measure those things quickly. Oh yeah, seasonal variation in the chat. You can see the bumps. So these are not seasonally adjusted data. Each bump happens over the course of a year. So the bump is during the cold and flu season, which usually peaks in, I think, February or something in the Northern Hemisphere in most places. Seasonality is an interesting question that's usually relegated to the brainiacs and propeller heads of things. It's obviously pretty important in a case like what we're looking at now. The seasonal adjustments also show up in the employment numbers, and so we won't have a full accounting of unemployment in April, which is really going to be when things start to have bitten, not for another 2 weeks or so. And there will be seasonally adjusted numbers coming out. What that does is it basically removes the typical amount that unemployment might have risen or fallen. Okay. I also wanted to, so I'm going to stop my share there. I think we are recording, aren't we? Okay, well, so because I'm adding my verbal clutter to things I always enjoy when I'm able to reduce the verbal clutter, but for now, I think I'll go ahead and just keep cluttering my verbality, if that's a term. And I'm going to share another thing that I thought would be useful to look at here. I didn't put this in the slides, but it's kind of cool. Is this big enough for people to see? Unauthorized immigrant workers are spread across industries. Great, folks are able to see it. This was from a paper that a co-author and I, Francesco Ortega, a really smart guy at Queens College in the City University of New York still, we had written it in 2016. It came out and it hit right before the presidential election. And as a result, garnered a lot of attention after the election and not a lot before. Our motivation was to think about the number of unauthorized immigrants in the country, which is around 11 million. Of that 11 million, about 7 million, that's what this number is, 7.1 million are working, which is a pretty high rate of labor force participation and employment. We then looked at across these different industries in the US economy, and I'll just read out a few of them, but agriculture is the top one. That's a pretty big one. Mining actually is still pretty significant, but the amount of employment in the United States is less than 1 million people employed in mining because of the mechanization and all that. But it's things like, for example, oil extraction in Texas. Construction is a big one, manufacturing, and then these days it's leisure and hospitality is probably most on our minds for industries that are hard hit by coronavirus. And there, the unauthorized share, so it's the number of unauthorized immigrants in that, working in that sector that we were estimating, is about 10%. So then in addition, another maybe 10 or 11%, and for a combined total of probably about a quarter of that industry's workers then would be immigrants of some variety. So foreign born who are either authorized, that's what this column is, and then we were looking specifically at the unauthorized immigrants. Immigrants are workers in all kinds of industries. That's one of the things that we've discovered, which I think runs a little contrary to what most of us might initially have thought. It is true that, especially like say the unauthorized share here of workers in agriculture is very high. It's almost 20%. Combine that then with authorized immigrants and you get a share that might be close to half or so of that industry who are foreign born. I think I did the math wrong there. That can't be quite right. It's a large number. 500 within the US born is a pretty big number, so it's not half. Let's say 40%. That's what's so the fun thing about trying to do these things on the fly. Agriculture is a big industry for unauthorized immigrants, but other industries are as well. And I think what might surprise you is, say, here in financial activities, so finance, insurance, real estate, about 2%. It's not zero. There are unauthorized immigrants in a variety of different industries. Unauthorized immigrants are a variety of different types of people. They could be highly educated people whose work visas expired, or who were here on travel visas and were not supposed to be working but are actually working anyway. That's kind of a gray area there, but then their travel visa can expire. I've known people who are unauthorized immigrants. It's not just people jumping border fences or somehow smuggled in container ships or something like that. Of course, that's usually one of the most dangerous ways to be an unauthorized immigrant. You can be unauthorized in a variety of ways, and you can, as many of you probably are more than fully aware, your visa can expire. Your travel papers might expire, perhaps unexpectedly. Perhaps you have to stay longer, and that creates a lot of unauthorized status. Questions about that before I move back into the main part of the material today? Does this exclude people working in the underground economy? That's a question in the chat. Not formally, no. It's based on survey responses, so it doesn't ask people to omit themselves if they are working in the underground economy. So what is the underground economy? Well, I mean, the really dark areas, of course, which, some you might see discussed in the newspaper or by politicians would be things like, illegal activity, right? That's one way of characterizing it, whether it's, drugs or prostitution or something. And I think that's such a small share of things. I don't know where somebody would ever report themselves as being, but there's another thing that you could call underground, which would be the cash for work kind of economy. And I think somebody is likely to say, well, I work in construction, if what they do is tend gardens, or they're a handyman or a handywoman or something like that. And so I think they would report themselves being in one of these industries here. An underground economy, you could argue, might exist in agriculture. It is true that unauthorized immigrants are in that industry, and perhaps might not get counted in formal ways as much, but they probably self-identify. And the argument as to why they would probably do that is there's no motivation, a negative one, of course, to reveal what your nature is. It's unauthorized. So if you're an unauthorized immigrant and there's a survey that arrives at your house, chances are you probably would fill it out, but just not tip your hat if if there wasn't a question on the form that's saying, well, are you here with documents or not? And most of these surveys do not have that for that reason. So there's no reason to answer any differently than one might expect an authorized immigrant or a native to answer. And so that's why the belief is here that the surveyor is probably measuring something real. Other questions before we move on? Yeah, the cash economy, yeah, which, and it's hard to get a sense of how big that really is, but I think it's substantial. Probably, of course, that cash economy might be the thing that's suffering the most right now, because I think all of us are concerned about actually, I mean, heck, we're concerned about using credit cards. So we're definitely concerned about handling cash to people. And when you think about it, then unauthorized immigrants who might participate more heavily in the unauthorized economy are probably going to be much more impacted by what has happened with this very sudden recession due to the coronavirus. And one hopes that they have other immigrant networks and family members to help spread the risk of this, spread the costs of being temporarily unemployed. It's a crazy time, isn't it? Other questions? I know you're dying to see graphs of economics and gains and losses. Okay, well, if you do think of a question, go ahead and type it out there. I'm going to stop my screen share and go back to my slide here. And share screen. I feel like at some point we're going to have computers that are seamlessly integrated with Zoom. I wonder, does anybody know if Siri is integrated with Zoom? Or I guess it's Alexa, right? That's who we should be wondering, whether the Amazon products are all like, Alexa, set me up with Zoom with my grandparents. Calling grandparents now. If that's interesting to you, by the way, I knew a very interesting chap who was working in the Division of Data Science. He was like a medieval studies graduate student, and he went on to work in the division of Amazon that was based, I think, in Massachusetts, but it was voice recognition and presumably working on Alexa. His big thing, it might have been linguistics, I guess. It was either medieval studies or something that was kind of in the humanities there, but he was a very technically adept guy and knew a lot of Python programming. So today, economic impacts and fiscal impacts. The lab number 10 on assortative mating is due this Friday. We talked about it some in office hours, and if you have additional questions, I hope I have straightened myself out a little bit on the lab, but there's a lot of detail there, a lot of empirical detail, because the lab looks at data, and there are, for example, the odds ratio measure that you might want to use, and why might you want to use it if you've got zeros and ones rather than continuous variables or pseudo-continuous variables like years of education, for example. And so there's a lot of confusing stuff in that lab, and I hope if you're confused, you can reach out on Piazza or in office hours, and I can, and the GSIs can and the other students can help you struggle through it. It's often a struggle. I struggle all the time trying to take the concepts in the course and apply them in an applied setting, looking at data to translate what I've been talking about and thinking about in the class into ways of looking at real data and some structure with analyzing them. So that's what Lab 10 is all about. Lab 11 will be due next Friday, and there is no Lab 12. Lab 13, as it were, is going to be a B courses quiz, not an RStudio lab, and that will be due, regret the word also, that's a typo there, on Friday the 1st, and it will be available earlier as well. And our intention there is to get a sense of our B courses quiz skills and hopefully enhancing them. Optional sections will be this Friday and Monday, and the final exam will be a B courses quiz written much more succinctly than Lab 13. So Lab 13 is going to astound you with its verbiage, and we will write a more concise final exam, I promise. Today, we'll finish up the economic impacts of immigration. So the two-country model, which I think we began last time, we will finish up. Then we'll talk about some of the implications of applying the solo model to the economics of immigration. Some of that, I think, will be direct review of topics, applications, I should say, of the solo model back when we saw it. And hopefully, generally, it's a review of the solo model itself that our intention, of course, was to have mastered that earlier. And it's easy to forget stuff. So we'll step through it and do ask questions if it wasn't clear the first time. Then we'll talk about the fiscal impacts of immigration. Do immigrants absorb more in government benefits? Do they trigger more government spending on things like education, on things like welfare, on Social Security and Medicare? Do immigrants cost more to taxpayers than natives, or do they cost more than they pay back in taxes? One of the big issues in this sandbox of topics is what's the counterfactual, or what are you comparing it to? Do you compare an immigrant to a native-born person? Do you compare the presence of a new immigrant to not the presence of a new immigrant? So you're imagining allowing one more immigrant to come and then thinking, well, what's the net fiscal impact of that choice of allowing an immigrant to come? And that abstracts from any comparison to natives. And it's not obvious whether that's really the right comparison to draw, but that usually is the way that it's phrased. A lot of politically fraught things, obviously, here, and we'll try to work through them. The learning objectives, I tried to write them down in this way. So in the economic impacts, we'd like you to understand the models of theoretical impacts. There, it depends a lot on the assumptions that you make. If you assume things don't adjust, like capital doesn't adjust, skilled labor doesn't adjust, educational attainment activity doesn't adjust. Those are all assumptions that you have to make there. And all of them might be somewhat incorrect, but it makes sense to start somewhere. And if we begin with the set of assumptions that nothing else adjusts, then we get the static model of labor demand and labor supply, and you'll see the short run impacts and the winners and losers. Qualitatively, I think that sets us on the right track, because it's clear that some groups are opposed to immigration and some groups are in favor of immigration, and understanding their position in the labor market can help make clear why that is. There, of course, are other reasons to either be in favor of or oppose immigration that are more political in nature, but the economic side of things at least deserves a seat at the table. Then long run impacts, when things like capital can adjust and maybe no losses at all, might pop out of that story. And then the confusing thing, I think, is probably how then we would like to test these hypotheses that come out of the theory with actual data. The problem is that we don't have a lab in which we measure immigrants arriving and we measure the national economy or a local economy. It doesn't work that way. Things happen and results can sometimes be completely buried in the data. So it takes a skilled hand to try to separate and understand control and treatment groups. And the problem is that as much as we might like to say that that's an objective way of looking at the science of it, it's true, but you have to make assumptions when you're doing that too. And that, unfortunately, is where some of the subjectivity comes in. How do you model counterfactuals when you're not set up with control and treatment groups? It's a very big question, and there's never going to be a single answer to that in social science research. I do think, though, that despite the fact that there's a lot of acrimonious debate, there's a lot of debate about this issue. What is the empirical finding? I think that the debate tends to be a pretty healthy one when it's within academic circles. When when it starts to spill over into think tanks and the policy world, it tends to get, I think, a lot more needlessly acrimonious. One of the things I looked at before class today was the fact that the Center for Immigration Studies, CIS, is one of the DC think tanks that weighs in about immigration. And I think they probably still make it into the slides here or there. There is valuable stuff that those people contribute. And there also is a lot of invective, a lot of cursing, you might say, a lot of strong language. And one of the, I think it's the Southern Law Poverty Center, has actually designated the CIS as being a hate group because of the rather flamboyantly ridiculous things that the leader of that group has taken to say. And of course, when I say the word "say," what I really mean is tweet or write, and then and then it gets distributed throughout the print media. Twitter is a magical tool, but I think sometimes it also brings out the worst in us. And I'm not saying that there is a worst or good side of any particular Twitter user in particular, but I think that it tends to get amplified a little bit. So if you do notice stuff from CIS, the Center for Immigration Studies, in the slides, it's because some of the things that they produce are based on data And we can look at that, and it's useful, I think, and we can ignore some of the more flamboyantly ridiculous things that they say. So that's the story with the economic impacts. There's theoretical takeaways that you need to be able to work with. And the two parts of it then are the labor demand model and thinking about labor supply shifting around and gains and losses. The other part of it is the solo model, when things are able to adjust, capital flows in and shifts out the labor demand curve. Also, technology might shift out the labor demand curve if immigrants bring technology, or if by, say, increasing the level of population, they increase the generation of new ideas and new technologies. That's Paul Romer's idea, and other people have had that idea as well. And that plausibly could be at work here in the long run, that immigrants could arrive and make us more productive at producing new ideas. Is a very vibrant strain of research that looks at that question. Moving on to the fiscal impacts, the punchlines there are these, I think. The numbers, the dollars of fiscal impacts, the net costs that taxpayers must pay, or the net benefit to the government finances that taxpayers would not have to pay because immigrants are here, are functions of these things. The children are expensive, and they're expensive because we educate them. I keep telling myself that, even though I've got a 3.5-year-old and a almost 15-month-old child, I think. And of course, it's me personally and my spouse, our household, that is paying to educate them right now. But once they get into kindergarten, and from kindergarten through 12th grade, they are educated by the state. And it's not the federal government, it's the state government. And that is costly. It's costly because education is costly, just like it's costly to go to UC Berkeley. It's costly to spend on children in K through 12. Well, why do we do it? It's because there's a payoff. You know, part of it is childcare, I suppose, so the parents can be productive. But if you didn't educate your children and just let them watch TV all day, you know that you'd see a real bad outcome ultimately. They would not be getting good jobs with good earnings, and they would not be paying taxes. Ultimately, then, that investment in children, whether they're children of immigrants or children of natives, will probably pay off. It depends, though, a lot on how successful the kids are at finishing their education. It turns out that children of immigrants are actually really successful at doing that. They seem to be very highly motivated, more so than the native children on average. And it could be, of course, because immigrants themselves are inherently different than natives because they have chosen to immigrate. The rest of us natives were just sort of born here. That's the way that works. So immigrants might be a select group that has higher skills and motivation. It's certainly possible, and it's one part of this whole story, and possibly they then pass those along to their children in a way that natives perhaps might not be able to do if we're talking about heritability, for example. So ultimately, the investment in children will probably pay off in higher taxes paid. The point is, it depends when you look at the fiscal impacts of immigration. If you look right now, you're going to see probably a decently large negative number associated with the fiscal impacts of immigration, because the country, the states, are paying to send those children to school. We're also paying to send native children to school, of course, but somehow we view that as not an optional thing, and we tend to view paying for immigrant children as more optional somehow. If you look over the long run, one is likely to see that having educated children will produce highly educated taxpayers who have higher earnings and pay more in taxes in the long run than they receive in benefits. Unauthorized immigrants are another part of the story where we don't have as much to say. One of the things we can say is that unauthorized immigrants tend not to stay in the United States past the age of 65. And a big reason for that is they are not eligible for health insurance provided by the government at that point. Medicare is what it's called in the United States. Health insurance becomes a pretty darn important thing, of course, when you get to those ages, and it turns out that there just aren't any unauthorized immigrants in the country then, so they do not absorb Social Security and Medicare, even though it turns out many of them pay into those systems with their payroll taxes. Not everyone works for cash when they're unauthorized. There are other ways of of doing it, it turns out, and they still pay taxes. It still benefits the rest of us, and they do not absorb taxes. Sorry, they do not absorb benefits later because they're not here to do it, and of course they wouldn't be eligible for it if they're unauthorized, and that's why they're not around. So those are the learning objectives. Are there questions about that? Okay. So here's the two-country picture that we saw starting last time. There have to be two labor demand curves. We've got a funny football goal post kind of story here because we're imagining there being one common amount of labor, that's the horizontal axis there, and then there's two different wages that we're interested in, the wage in the poor country here on one side, I guess it's that from your perspective, and the wage in the rich country on this side. And of course you could flip them, that's what Michael Clemens does in his article. The key is that there have to be labor demand curves at different heights, meaning how far they're shifted out with extra capital and technology here. And so here, from your perspective, the rich country has this labor demand curve that's shifted out. There was some discussion about the slope of these things, and I'm going to remain agnostic about that. The issue is that you have to have one sort of above the other because the blue one is shifted out. It's the rich country has more capital. It also typically has more technology, and either one of those will shift out the labor demand curve. So wages are high in the rich country because there's more capital and more technology in the rich country. And there's a motivation to migrate. So it would be, of course, the entire amount of potential migrants from this dashed line here. LR is the original number of unskilled workers in the rich country. It would be this number all the way up to where the red and blue lines cross, who would be interested in moving. Because if that larger number actually got up and moved, they would eventually push the wage all the way down to this crossing point. And at that point, there wouldn't be any wage gain to moving. Because immigration is restricted, it makes sense to limit this amount of immigration we're imagining as occurring to just this amount. You know, if we just limit it there, there's going to be a reduction in the short run in the wage in the rich country, and actually a rise in the short run in the wage in the poor country. There are winners and losers also. Here we've got a more fleshed out view of what's going on with the immigrants themselves, where the rectangle that I just called C before gets split up into C1 and C2. C1 was what they were earning, the area of that is the wage they originally had times the number of immigrants who were there. And now what they're earning is this higher wage WR prime times the number of migrants that we're talking about here. And so the addition to their returns is this teal box here, C2. It's very clear then to see this is why they immigrate. They get a higher wage, but also the total wage bill, the total amount of GDP that's produced somewhere gets shifted over to them in this part. It's also, I think, stepping back for a second, we have produced this new amount of GDP where if we had started here, we're actually getting this trapezoidal region, I think, of new world production. And I think I did not say that quite as clearly. There's a net domestic gain G, just like before, but I think what maybe I had not actually listed, although maybe it's coming up here in the scorecard, there's a total overall benefit to, if you like, humanity from this much larger piece, C2. And that's what Michael Clemens writes about. It's just a tremendously big thing if you think about the vast differences between rich and poor countries, and we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so here's the story with the sending country, where this is actually, if you like, a deadweight loss or just a loss to GDP, whatever you like to call it, this little purple triangle GF for the foreign country. And GF disappears. It's a net loss to the foreign economy. C2 technically also disappears from the foreign economy, but it's stuff that's earned. It's returns that are earned by the immigrants in the new country in which they are, in the rich country. So it doesn't, that part doesn't really go poof per se, but it gets ripped away from the domestic economy. Thinking about this, one might step back and say, well, what's the motivation here? If these curves actually don't shift, why would a country be in favor of letting its citizens leave? And there, you might think about, well, in fact, there was a period of time when there wasn't at all free movement of people out of a particular part of the world. And of course, today still, there are a lot of restrictions on it. But what I'm talking about is in the post-World War II era, when the Iron Curtain, representing the political dominance of the Soviet Union around Eastern Europe and around its own territory, of course, prevented a lot of people from legally leaving. There were walls all over the place back then. Of course, the Berlin Wall was the most famous version of that. Now, why would people want to leave? Part of it probably was earning a higher wage in the West compared to and there too, the empty store shelves and the lower quality of life that one would have in communist society, which of course we're all reminded of these days when the store shelves are all vacant and devoid of the one thing that we wanted to go buy. Maybe it's toilet paper these days, obviously. Generally, capitalist countries have had a better time keeping things on the shelves, and that was part of the problem with communism. So part of it is a change in living standards. Of course, the other thing was political freedoms as well. Here, this is a story about economic gains. The modern parallel to this, though, is you might wonder, well, suppose the poor country we're thinking about here, if we've got the US as the rich country, suppose the poor country then might be Mexico. And what's the motivation for Mexico to allow this to happen? Because it means that there's a reduction in GDP. And I would have to think about it. It would be a net benefit, of course, to the low-skilled workers in Mexico. That's their wage actually rises here. But if capital and high-skilled workers stay in Mexico and they haven't changed their shares, their numbers, I guess I should say, the amount of these stocks of production, factors of production that are there, they lose, especially given how we would imagine that it's probably high-skilled workers and capital that sort of tend to run these countries. Why would they be in favor of that? And that's kind of an open question. One thing you could say is that the labor market earnings for unskilled labor or for anybody else is translated into cash, and you could what's called repatriate the cash. If you were working abroad, you could send it back home. And in fact, it turns out that in many cases, immigrants into the United States would either do this outright, they'd send the cash back home, or they would save the cash so that when they returned, they had a whole bunch of cash to be able to purchase capital or start a firm or something like that in their original native country. It's also not the case that all immigrants do that, and a lot of them migrate and then they stay in the rich country. But that's part of what might change this, and I think it's a little bit mystifying, honestly, as to why poor countries would be so in favor of this kind of thing, of just having everybody up and leave. It seems like sort of a sad story in terms of the returns, except for one group, and that is that it's the low-wage workers in the poor country, the folks who are supplying the labor. Those who are left are actually benefited. They gain this rectangle RF that gets pulled away from domestic capital and skilled labor in that country. So they benefit, but politically speaking, you would imagine they probably don't have much power at the polls. And so why this actually happens in reality is kind of a good question. Here's then our scorecard. In the immigrant receiving country like the United States, suppose what we're modeling is a movement of unskilled labor. Again, that's an assumption here. We're not talking about PhDs and brain drain. That's another story altogether. We're talking about poor immigrants who would earn a lot more in construction or in agriculture, mostly, not exclusively, but that's mostly what we're talking about in the United States rather than, say, being in Mexico. So the amount then rises in the United States and the wage of unskilled labor falls, and we see the reverse of that happening over here. We'd see less unskilled labor competing against other unskilled labor there for employment and bidding wages down. So wages rise actually in a place like Mexico that's sending these unskilled workers. The returns to the other factors domestically actually rise, and the returns actually fall in the sending countries as long as other things don't adjust. And of course they could, and one would have to tell a story about exactly how that might go, but you might imagine that the capital would move in some way to maximize its returns. And so probably it would move out of Mexico and into the United States here. It would, if that happened, that would raise the return to capital in Mexico because the amount of capital would fall. Unskilled labor in the United States, that's, I mean domestic by this line here, ends up losing, so not the immigrants. And the unskilled labor that's left behind in Mexico would win. You would see gains, winning. That word is so funny these days, and it's always winning. That skilled labor or capital would win, and it would lose in the sending country. Immigrants gain, that's kind of the whole point. Obviously they have to, or otherwise they wouldn't actually migrate. And we'd see a reduction in domestic GDP in the sending country, a rise in the receiving country. And thus you could say that there is a gain to immigration in the receiving country and a loss in the sending country. I think what I didn't really make clear though, and hopefully this will be more clear when we look at not next slide, but this one, it's this huge welfare gain because of some large relocation of labor that would be so staggeringly big. We up to now have just been talking about the triangles here, but a big part of this story is this huge gain, which of course is earned, I think, all by the immigrants themselves. If we look back at this graph back here, it's this C2 thing, roughly. I may not have drawn it perfectly right. It might be a trapezoid or something, but it's this thing which goes to the immigrants themselves. And you know, you could say that as being salient here, that, you know, if you're an immigrant yourself, you're receiving this big increase, and that's a huge net gain to the world as a whole because of the relocation of labor. But it's you, the immigrant, who is seeing it privately. And you might say, well, okay, the thing is that there are factors then in the sending country that are losing. They're not maybe going to be that happy about it, and these gains are privatized. They're internalized. They're received by the immigrants themselves, except maybe for transport costs or something. And you might imagine, you know, there are equity issues about that. I guess I shouldn't say too much more because, to be honest, I'm not really sure what I'm talking about. But I think it's true. You know, the fact that wages are not equalized, that big relocations don't actually happen, even though it looks like the benefits to the world in terms of GDP probably has a lot to do with this issue about who actually benefits. You could say, well, all right, well, everybody gains. Okay, you know, free trade helps everybody. That seems much more obvious when you're talking about free trade lowering prices of consumer goods because we're all consumers. But when you're talking about international relocation and who benefits from that, it's pretty obvious to think, well, okay, the immigrants gain for sure, but also native capital gains from in-migration, and that's very different than a broad-based kind of benefit. I also admit that it's greater than that, that if there are more immigrants into, say, California agriculture, which is a big part of the story in this state, it's not the only part, that means that agricultural products are cheaper, and we all benefit from that because we all have to eat. Just like I just can't help it mentioning, but it's just like the great children's story, which you can see. So I've talked about the Cat in the Hat, and the Cat in the Hat comes back, and there's a great book that's, I think, actually Japanese in origin, but it's been translated, called Everyone Poops. And everyone poops because everybody eats. And that's part of what the book says. And of course, that's, you know, all about the potty training stuff, which we've luckily gotten past, at least for child number one. Okay, back to C175. And so this table shows these just staggeringly large gains as a percent of world GDP that are associated with removing all barriers to labor mobility. And of course, this is a world that you almost can't even fathom. That, you know, would this actually happen? Okay, maybe. It's certainly not going to be something you could empirically measure particularly well, because it's never going to happen. There's never going to be full labor mobility all over the world, meaning anybody can move to wherever they want, make whatever wage they want. Compared though to these other policies that are typically discussed in the undergraduate economics curriculum, here, barriers to merchandise trade. That's a big one, of course, historically. Before you walk or run, you've got to crawl. And the global economy started first with these simpler things of trading goods, of allowing foreign ownership of capital. That's really what capital flows mean. People who are investors in one country sending their funds into another country to supply funds so that entrepreneurs and capitalists in that country can build factories and equipment. And so they owe some of the returns generated by that development overseas. It's hard to trust people. And trade was one step there, a pretty obvious one, I think. The capital flows thing is the next one. All of these don't seem to really affect our well-being nearly as much as just the football stadium's worth of GDP that we're talking about here with labor mobility. And that's revealed then by this graph that Michael Clemens gives us. It looks a lot like the one that we already had seen. The high and low wage groups are reversed here. So the high wage country has got its labor demand curve starting here on the right and then trailing down to the left. And the point is that it's higher than the labor demand curve here in the low wage country. A very, very large amount of net gain in GDP if say this movement from L to L prime were to happen here. So big potential gains. That's the story, of course, in theory. I wanted to return now to some more discussion about the empirics of the economics of immigration, but let me pause there just for a second, see if there are any questions. And considering that immigrants benefit, what is the story when farmers are paid on a piece rate basis and make less than minimum wage? I would have to think about that. I'm not sure. There are departures from the simple story a lot of times, of course, in economics. And in economics, the simple story is that you've got a labor demand and a labor supply curve, and people figure it out. There are reasons why markets might not clear particularly easily, and there are reasons why there might be departures from the standard assumptions, which are things like property rights, the rule of law, things like that. So I'm not sure. I'd have to take a look. Are there other questions? Okay. Sorry for the back and forth here. I'm all thumbs here with my navigation. Okay, we might also like to know the empirical gains or losses, what actually happens to wages after immigration. And so one way of doing it then is going to be the marital boat lift that we'll get to in several slides here, and my more funny jokes that pop into all this. Another thing that we might do is just think from the beginning about measuring this sort of thing. Yes, Alejandro is raising your hand. Yes. Sorry, I tried to click on you, but it looks like perhaps I wasn't able to do it. So let me try to find you in the participants. I apologize for that. Okay, how about that? I think have I unmuted you? I've tried to. I'm sorry. I wonder if this is not working. Oh, I see. Alejandro is asking, there's a question in the chat. Sorry. How about that? Can you go now, Alejandro?
It was just Dan's question. He asked, yeah. He asked, are we assuming that immigrants maintain their type of labor when they immigrate?
Oh, that's a really good question. My apologies for missing it. Thanks for flagging that. Thank you. Okay. I promise at some point my Zoom skills will be up to snuff, but I feel like I've still got training wheels on. Okay. So in the chat, Dan's question is, are we assuming the immigrants maintain their type of labor when they immigrate? And the answer is absolutely yes in the simple models of this. And by the implication that you're raising here, by implication, if you relax that, you're going to see a different story. Now, let's be careful though about what we imagine happening here. The usual thing is going to be that immigrants are leaving behind their country-specific human capital and skills when they immigrate. An immigrant has knowledge of the way a particular country functions. So then you would expect the story to be that the immigrant would probably see a reduction in the tier of skills that he or she or they bring to the table after immigrating. Why? Well, there are these country-specific forms of skills and human capital that you don't have unless you're in the country. This is seen anecdotally with things like folks like doctors. I mean, I think what we see in the newspaper, of course, is that at the very top, when there's a very notable, say, death because of COVID-19 and it's associated with a doctor who's like a super disease specialist or something like that. I think that sort of individual who another story is here, they might be a foreign national in the UK, but they probably spent at least some time at a UK university or a US university or something like that. I think what we might think about more generally is somebody who went to medical school, who's a primary care physician who is trained that way in, say, a country like Mexico, would probably have a hard time becoming a primary care physician off the bat if he or she or they came into the United States. And the reason is that person has Mexico-specific skills, and you need to have US-specific skills to be an effective primary care physician. So that person probably would take a job at a somewhat down the skill tier in a medical care delivery environment. Did that make sense? Great, thanks for that excellent question. And Nicole's question is, but the immigrants are still unskilled despite a change in skills. Well, that's a really good question too. In the simple model, we're imagining that it's unskilled immigration, unskilled immigrants, meaning people without a lot of schooling who are doing the moving. And they basically stay unskilled. They don't go up in the skills structure, and they don't go down because you can't go any further down. That's really, I think, the bottom line there. If you are a manual laborer and you tend gardens and you build things, that's a fairly low skill. Now, I want to be careful about that because, of course, construction workers, I'm watching some right outside our house right now, and they're laying pavement, they're putting down new asphalt. These are not people with no skills, but when you think about a construction team, they do have to have somebody who shovels stuff. And so that's often what we're talking about when it's a low skill immigrant who supplies labor. It's not that they have no skills or knowledge. Of course they do. I wouldn't know where to start personally if I was a gardener. The internet, right? I don't know how to do it. So I'm not saying that people have no skills, but what I'm saying is that there's not going to be an upward movement in the skill structure. If anything, it's downward. And if you're at the bottom of the totem pole, if you thought about people with less than a high school degree, there's kind of nowhere to go beneath that. So they're going to stay in that tier. Other questions? Okay, thanks. That's an interesting little side diversion. That's great. So getting back to how we might measure this, you might just think, well, you could think about measuring wages. And the problem with doing that is that the foreign-born, although this is changing a bit in terms of the geographic distribution of where immigrants go, the traditional issue is that immigrants tend to head toward wages are high. If you were an immigrant, you wouldn't go to a place where wages were low. And if money was money and everything else was the same, and of course, the issue is, well, sometimes it isn't because maybe housing costs are different. You might see this kind of thing, which is where, there's not a perfectly tight correlation here. So the correlation coefficient that you would say is here, it might be something like 0.4 or so, but it's an upward sloping relationship in these data from this paper in the mid-1990s. But I think you still see something very much like this, where here's Los Angeles with a high % foreign born and a pretty high average wage and salary income. So their earnings are pretty high on average. They're even higher in a place like New York City. Here's San Francisco. I don't think Berkeley or Oakland makes it in here, unfortunately. I think it's really a big story about the foreign-born in San Francisco. That's a pretty high share. Miami is here, a little bit off the locus down low, so lower wages and salary down there. Now, it's true that you might say that, okay, the immigrants are also going to have to go where they have immigrant communities or families, or they need to figure out a way in these high wage cities, which are also usually high price, high rent cities, to economize. And that's true. And in fact, there's a lot to that immigrants tend to go where previous immigrants of their national origin have set up shop because of obvious things, like I just was referring to there, that any immigrant from your home country is going to share the same knowledge and background and customs, roughly speaking, that you came with. A lot of times, formal and informal, say, finance works in these little pockets of immigrants. You can get a loan more easily, say, for, I think we had a landlord in New York, and I believe she was Polish American, and I think financed all of her flipping of houses. She did that for a living. She flipped houses, and I think she financed it all through a bank that was run by Polish Americans, and they had this country-specific human capital that translated into the immigrant community in New York City. So obviously, thus there are ways around this problem of kind of losing all your capital when you immigrate, but of course it's still not going to be a sort of a perfectly non-depreciated thing, I guess I should say, something like that. So the purpose of this slide then is to say that the thing about the economic impacts and measuring them in data is that you're going to see this problem, this selection issue. How do you get around that? It might be something like looking at the Mariel boat lift, a natural experiment. And of course, this is a salient topic to mention today, and to apologize for any time that social scientists rave about natural experiments as somehow being these wonderful things, because natural experiments usually are things that are tremendously disruptive and possibly even ending of human lives. And that's not cool at all. They're never happy. You could say the Mariel boat lift was a change away from unhappiness, because what happened with the Mariel boat lift, as we'll see on the next slide, was actually Fidel Castro, the leader at the time, he's now died, lifting restrictions on political detainees effectively. And so that was quite good for them. I guess a rare example of an actual experiment that was a good thing. A lot of times what we look at are things that are very tragic, like say COVID-19 or an earthquake or warfare or other things that we think individuals generally have not a lot of control over. You have to always kind of wonder, well, all right, but politicians usually have a decent amount of control over a lot of these things, probably not earthquakes. And that's probably true, but then ask yourself whether the individuals who get treated by the natural disaster, if that's what it is, or some other natural event, natural experiment, where, it's an event en masse, if they are really the same, basically, as the politicians whose roles sometimes are relevant here, but usually are not. So we don't like awful things. Nobody should, right? Social scientists, however, are appreciative of the ability to study these things, because what it means is that if people are doing something because they have to, they haven't chosen to do it. And that's very meaningful, because on the previous slide, the point about this is that immigrants generally choose to go to high wage areas if they can. That's what we see here. It's not, of course, not across the board. There's deviations here where, the reason Miami is so heavily foreign born is because of the Cuban American diaspora that's very heavily located there. So a lot of things matter, not just wages, but wages are certainly part of it. People choose to go for a variety of reasons. And I guess, stepping back, that of course might be part of the thing about the Mariel boat lift and why maybe we didn't see an effect. That's the punchline of the Mariel boat lift. You might say, well, a big part of the reason why folks went there and stayed there, and maybe it worked out pretty well, is because of the Cuban American diaspora and the support then that enclave could give to other Cuban American immigrants. And so maybe the simple model that we have in our heads of the downward sloping labor demand is just far too divorced from human realities, where humans find ways to work together, especially if they share common customs and common national origin, common religion, common all kinds of things. You can be members of a family, and you'll look out for each other. I think even then you would say, well, you know, if you have a brother or sister who got out of prison and comes home, you would expect to see some effect in the short run that would probably reflect some bottlenecks and resources. In the long run, maybe the person, you know, gets out of prison and they contribute as much as the sibling who never was sent to prison. That's possible, but you would think in the short run you might see something. All right, so the Mariel boat lift is the underneath it all is the topic that's sort of driving this famous movie, which was from must have been in the 1980s. I wish I had the date on here, but it's Scarface, starring Al Pacino, who of course now is a very old man. You may not even know who he is because he's a generation far older than yours, and so I remember the one thing too. He's co-author here, which if you squint. Just trying to see if her name is even here. It's Brian De Palma. I mean, it's a classic Hollywood thing, right? I mean, there's Al Pacino mentioned here, but it's Michelle Pfeiffer who's the female lead in that movie. And I don't know what deal with the devil she has made, but man, she looks the same as she did 40 years ago. It's the craziest thing. It's amazing what science can do, I guess, in certain pockets of medicine. And Al Pacino has fully embraced the grizzled old man. He does not at all look the same. Which I guess the good thing you can say there is he obviously was not snorting as much cocaine over his lifetime as this character was. That was the motivation or conceit here, is that the fiction was all about a drug kingpin who came over in the Mariel boat lift. This lays bare a couple of useful things here. This often is what you will hear about immigration from certain parts of the political spectrum, and it's garbage. It's completely silly. Here's a statistic about this, that 2% of immigrants were criminals under US law, and they were not granted US citizenships. The whole thing is totally made up. And if you look at the sociology report of the National Academies of Science, I don't think I have a slide on it yet, developed it, but maybe we'll look at it next time. The amount of crimes that are committed on average by people who are foreign born is less than the number of crimes committed on average by people who are native born. It's just fiction. It's a fun story that's, you know, Hollywood likes to tell, and I think some people have been watching too many Hollywood movies. A large migration, though, and so you could view this as a big shock to the Miami labor market, which at the time employed about 700,000. And so not all these Cubans were workers, but if you thought about maybe 70,000 of them were, you would see then a shock of about maybe 10% rather, I'm sorry, to the size of the labor market there, which is a pretty big deal. Surprisingly, though, you would think this ought to show up somehow in the statistics. You would think that wages might fall in the short run, especially with this point that we'd seen last time, that current waves of immigrants typically compete the most with previous waves of those same immigrants because they're probably most similar to those workers, namely previously arrived Cuban Americans. But surprisingly, there was basically no impact revealed in this famous 1990 study by David Cartman. Of course, he's at UC Berkeley. How many of you have seen him in a classroom, like in econ? Is it 100A is micro? Has anybody taken that with him? Oh, C142. Well, that's like econometrics or something, right? Yeah, you're taking his class right now. Yeah. So when I was an undergraduate, his previous university was Princeton. I was there, and I took the equivalent of 100A from him. He's just an amazing guy. He has done so much and is so energetic, just legendarily so. And he's great with students too. I don't know whether he ever accepts undergraduate thesis advisees. I hope that he does, but of course that would be the big question. And anyway, a fantastic person. I'm glad you were able to cross paths with him. So why does he think that there was no impact that pops out of this? Now, I should say, actually, as I go on here, that George Borjas is, again, a very smart guy who's at Harvard. He himself is a Cuban-American immigrant. He also, this is ironic too. So my previous employment was at Queens College in the City, University of New York, and it turns out George Borjas was also a professor there actually for a while before going to Harvard. So Borjas will raise some stink about whether in fact there was no impact of the Marielitos on wages and employment. And his argument hinges on effectively whether you can take the small numbers of African Americans without a high school degree in Miami in these two time periods, the before and after, if you can model what they would have been earning in some reasonable way, then maybe we might see a negative impact on them. These are the least well-off Black workers. And that's plausible to find. It's just that if you read his papers about this, he kind of does a lot of gymnastics trying to figure out a way to construct the data in some sensible way. You could say smooth way, basically, of trying to just construct a number. And it's really hard. If you remember back at the very beginning of class, we were looking at flu deaths and we saw a bunch of jagged stuff and all that. And that's with a decently sized sample of people who have died in the seasonality and all that. The problem is he's looking at many, many fewer people, like maybe 10. And that you just see such noise in those data. So he has a bone to pick with this, but I guess I think that David Card is a little bit more believable on this side of things. And he says, well, here are some reasons why maybe we didn't see an effect. Maybe Miami had gotten really good at assimilating immigrants, and that's plausible, especially with its long history of receiving Cuban immigrants. Maybe prior immigrants had been ready to move on and up, creating space for new immigrants, or possibly maybe hiring them too. You could view it that way. And more recently, I've heard him say, so he came and advised the National Academy's panel that on the economics and fiscal impacts back in 2016, and he came in and he basically said capital. He said capital adjusts. And so that's what we'll look at here shortly, that, if you look at the Solow model and think about a shock of immigration, in a dynamic setting, there's really no reason to think that there ought to be some big negative impact. So it's not a universal result. Again, George Borjas' story here is that if you look at Native groups who are most likely to be affected by a wave of immigration, say with the Marielitos, he says that those groups have been hurt. And in particular, he focuses, say, on high school dropouts. And he's got a paper, I think this is the QJE one, called Yes, the Labor Demand Curve Slopes Down. And I think he models it this way. And he says it's 4 to 8% lower wages over a 20-year period. Okay, it's especially for that group that those might be rather salient. The average gains, of course, are higher, but I think I regret phrasing it this way in the fourth bullet point, because what you really want to know is the trend for wages among high school dropouts, and of course that's been quite dreary overall. But I think the bigger problem with his examination of this is that it relies on extraordinarily, at least in the Mariel Boatlift case, extraordinarily small samples. It's very tough to pick anything apart there. And so often what Borjas will say is that, well, we don't know. It's noise. And I think that's a very reasonable way of describing this, especially with the Mariel Boatlift. With other instances, I think part of the problem is that the situations are so different that we often just see heterogeneity in the results. Generally speaking, though, there isn't much evidence ever that immigration causes large losses, but there is evidence of small losses, but also possibly no losses, or possibly even small gains. So it's kind of all over the map. It's just that I think we can rule out really big changes associated with immigration in the empirical setting. So let me talk now about the dynamic macro model, which is basically the Solow model. You could view it in other frameworks as well, but I think the natural one for us to think about here is the Solow model. And I just put up a stupid quote of mine that because I couldn't think of another good one that would be useful. I wish David Card had, his remarks, I suppose, might have been written down somewhere. But when I heard him say that was kind of the best point or best way of phrasing it. It's capital, it's adjusting here. And my way of sort of translating it is to say that the labor demand curve slopes downward in the short run. In the long run, it may not, because the demand curve might get shifted out. So here's the Solow model again. And we've got a saving curve here. That's the saving rate times output per worker, which is given by technology, that's uppercase A bar, times capital per worker, that's little k, which is the variable here along the horizontal axis, to the power of, say, 1/3, which is a good number to choose for the Cobb-Douglas production function. We've got a total depreciation line, which tells us about the rate at which population growth gives us new workers without capital, and that decreases, other things equal, that decreases capital per worker. We've got depreciation that just breaks capital per worker, and so there's got to be some equilibrium there, and that's the steady state at the star. The choice then is modeling immigration in the Solow model either as a change in the flow of new labor. I'm not sure that was phrasing the flow of labor sounds like something different. Immigration is the flow of new labor, not from domestic sources. I guess you could say that. It's an addition to the population growth rate. You could think about the parameter of the population growth rate reacting to the level of immigration. That's a reasonable thing to do. That's also probably the salient thing. Yeah, I think it probably is the salient thing for modern policy in the United States. And the reason is apparently the Trump administration, prior to, COVID-19 and everything becoming crazy, I think it was last summer, they had floated a rather serious trial balloon about reducing the total number of annual immigrants by a factor of 2, like, cutting it in half, basically. They are interested in exploring that. Nothing has happened, but it would be a story about this kind of thing. And do they know what the Solow model is? I kind of doubt it, but I think that the tenets that one would see when you model the change in the Solow model population growth rate, that's kind of what they have in mind, bottom line. So that's one way of going with this. The other option then is to say that immigration is just a discrete flow like the Mariel boat lift, which looks very different here. Then in addition to that, you have to think about whether immigrants also bring new capital or new technology. Do they save at the same rate as natives? All those things are salient. And if some of that is different or special, then one has to make allowances for it. The thing off the shelf, out of the box then, is we would say, well, let's think about immigration changing the rate of population growth. Let's suppose all new immigrants save at the same rate as natives, and suppose they do not bring capital, which is a pretty reasonable thing to assume, and that they also don't enhance technology, so they don't shift the blue curve up because of bringing more technology or more knowledge. And so that's debatable. I think that's maybe the most obvious one. And I apologize for all the details here in the notes here. If you use this functional form, you will find that there's a relationship between the percentage changes of these sorts of things, and it's here in the 4th bullet point, but I don't want to go into great detail, and I doubt we will ask that on the final exam because we didn't spend much time developing it. So this was from when I was teaching Econ 100B, the macro course. Qualitatively, what we're talking about here is an increase in immigration pivots the green line in a counterclockwise fashion. So it pivots upward. We'd be finding a new lower steady state K prime. I've kind of bollocked this up a little bit, but here back at the purple star rather than the orange star. And then the story is that you'd see lower per capita income, lower output per worker. That's the level here. It corresponds to this lower level of capital per worker. Behind the scenes, you would actually see faster growth of the labor supply, and thus also faster growth of the capital stock and faster growth of output, which I think may be lost on some of the people who are against immigration. Population growth is an engine of growth in total output and total GDP, and that's, of course, a lot of what people care about. But it's also true that output per person or per worker here reaches some steady state level in this model, and it's actually lower than it was prior to immigration. So that's kind of the end of the story on that side of the Solow model. Are there questions? The other way to model immigration in the Solow model is as a one-time shock. And here, the arrow is showing the return back to the old steady state. I wish I probably should have taken the star off there, because the star isn't really a steady state in this version of the scenario. Suppose immigration was just a one-time increase in labor. What you would see then is a jump from K star down to some level K prime. It's not a steady state, but you would see a reduction in capital per worker because the number of workers increased overnight with this boatload of Marielitos, for example, coming and joining the labor force. It would reduce capital per worker in the short run. But as long as immigrants didn't change the saving rate, and if they didn't affect the level of technology, then the original steady state would persist, and the economy would move back to it. And along the way, it would actually see a decent amount of growth. So that's those are the kind of the two canonical ways of modeling it. Hopefully, it's review for us at this stage. Are there questions? Let me go ahead and then move to the last topic here, and at least we'll have time to talk about this, the fiscal impacts of immigration. And here I found a quote from Pia Arrhenius, who is a fantastic researcher. She served on the economics panel that released the 2016 report. And it's kind of a long quote. Let's see if I can untangle it for you. If immigrants are assigned the marginal cost of public goods like defense spending, and the marginal cost for defense spending of an immigrant is probably zero. Defense spending is a public good that we all can enjoy and not deplete. Then the long-term fiscal impact of immigration is positive, and the short-run effect is negative, but very small, and less negative than that of natives. There's a lot to unpack there, but what she's saying is that if we take a realistic approach to understanding the fiscal impact of immigrants, they probably don't raise things like defense spending, which is a pretty decent part of what we spend our money on. And they seem to have this long-run impact that's positive because we educate their children. They, of course, do it also, but we are subsidizing it. As taxpayers, we subsidize everybody's children. The short-run effect is negative, but very small. That's reflecting the costs of education. But it turns out that right now, the mix of immigrants is actually rather favorable in terms of their skills and thus their costs and the number of children. It's not as if every immigrant arrives, with like 10 kids or something like that. And although it's the case that the total fertility rate among immigrant women is higher in the short run, their family sizes are not so darn much higher. It appears, I think it's kind of the new evidence emerging, than say native born. And it turns out that compared to natives, maybe they're better deals in terms of government spending versus taxes. Excuse me, which is the comparison that I think rarely really gets made in the public sphere. And part of the problem there is it's like, well, why would you compare immigrants to natives? It makes a lot of sense on some level. On another level, maybe it doesn't, because you don't have the policy option of not having a new native. That's not something that's a policy option. Okay, but it still is useful to compare immigrants to natives, I think, to kind of get a broader sense of what's going on. Well, how does she base this? Well, there's an entire chapter, of course, in the report, just like there was in the 1997 report. And what we're talking about are amounts of additional spending minus the additional government taxes that are triggered or incurred by, say, an extra immigrant. And natives also have fiscal impacts. It's just that there's no obvious policy there to, say, remove a native or not let a native into the country, or it is true that how much natives absorb versus contribute should be part of the story with what guides policy. Should we expand or contract government spending or taxes? And that's something, of course, that we will have to face over the next 10 to 20 years after recovery from the coronavirus, as the baby boom generation becomes fully retired, as you guys start to support not only them in retirement, but also me in retirement. That is something we will all have to face, and it's certainly salient at that point. What's the fiscal impact of a native? And how can we think about bearing that or reducing that fiscal impact? Because ultimately it's going to be, native US taxpayers who are young now who will be paying for it or guiding us to some resolution, some way of balancing the books, so to speak. Here's an example of a headline from some time ago. This almost seems quaint, I guess. Now that every time you open the New York Times, of course, it's some horrific story about the coronavirus, and it used to be something a little bit more about something like this. That especially in a place like California, immigrant children were swelling the rolls of the local schools. We live right across the street, actually, from an elementary school here in what's actually West Contra Costa, but I can say that this is certainly salient here, that there are many, many immigrant children here as well. And the local ballot measures right before we moved, they failed, meaning that the school has really had to figure out very inventive ways of expanding the number of classrooms it has available. And I don't know what it has done with children relative to teachers, whether they've hired more teachers, but it's one of the most heavily over-enrolled schools in the entire district, and probably in the entire Bay Area at this point. It's right next door. It's right next door. I really miss them though, because the school's been closed, of course, as you guys all know. The school's been closed for quite some time, and the best part, before the school closed, I think just about everybody had seen the movie Frozen 2. And so all the kids would do, they'd sing to each other with that little, the barn burner song in Frozen 2, if you've ever seen the movie. They'd be singing that to each other. They'd be going, ah, and it was all the time right across the street. So I was working home, I'd hear that all the time. Of course, now I can't, which is sort of sad. Immigrant children are children, and they go to school. And the thing about that is that there are these bottlenecks that are produced by that, whether it's natives having more children, whether it's natives not paying their taxes, and so the schools aren't funded, or whatever it is. If it's immigrants arriving, that's going to potentially produce a bottleneck. So what are the things that we're talking about here? One of them is for sure schools, and that's a huge thing. Federal defense spending, though, is another part of it, and also federal spending on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and what we would usually consider the social safety net. That is also a big part of this. And of course, today, unemployment insurance is an enormous part of what we are attempting to do. Just as a side note, actually, I haven't looked at it, but it appeared we actually got a direct deposit from the federal government of the stimulus checks. I think that just happened perhaps yesterday. I've yet to look at it. But apparently they are being sent. If it's easier for them to send out an electronic deposit. So if your parents, for example, if you were listed as a dependent on their taxes, they will be receiving a check and not you. If you filed your own taxes, you'll be receiving a check. There are then, so federal sources of spending, and also all kinds of things that states do. So one thing that's happening outside our house right now is the roads. The utilities get subsidized, police and fire, of course, are other big things as well. Some of these categories, though, are public goods where it's not obvious that increasing the number of people in a particular country is going to have to increase the spending. Defense is an obvious one. Also, though, police, fire, roads, utilities, the things that are definitely not public goods, even though, so this is the problem here, they are publicly provided, but the problem is that there are these big bottlenecks here that providing the teaching is a huge problem for K through 12, and that's expensive. So I think we've reached the end of our time. I had a lot more fun, I guess, than I thought I would, and so my eyes were too big for the slide deck, and so we'll come back to the rest of this next time. Hopefully Andrea isn't going to be overwhelmed in section. Are there questions before we depart? There's some questions in the chat about stimulus checks. So there are, I think you have to be under 17, perhaps. I'm trying to remember what the rules are about extra money that gets sent to families if they have children of particular ages. And then so one student saying only if under 16 years old. That sounds right to me. Or a full-time student under age 24. Okay, I haven't had any time to research any of this myself, and so best wishes to all of you. If you have filed your own taxes, you will probably receive a check. If you're on your parents' returns. I guess it's a question of what your age and status is. Good luck. I hope it works out. I hope you get more money, because I think that is what we all need at this point. I don't think there's anybody who would dispute that. More cash, more payments, more well-being. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Here's one more question. What is RK? The cost of capital is on the y-axis, and so is an increase or decrease. We can talk about that in office hours, but quickly, it's a way of looking at the amount that's going to capital. This is the wage, it turns out, and it turns out what's left over after you look at output per worker. Part of it goes to the wage, and part of it goes into the returns per worker to capital. A question about stimulus checks lead to inflation? Not a chance. No, it's deflation that's the big risk right now. The Fed thinks it's got a handle on it, and I am inclined to believe them given their experience over the last 15 years or so, but it's anybody's guess. Thank you. Have a great weekend. See you next week. Apologies to Andrea again if I didn't cover enough. I'm really sorry about that. See you later.